I come from the Syrian Orthodox Church in India. Unfortunately, I don't have so much that I can tell on behalf of my church that we are doing around this issue of HIV and AIDS. Basically because sadly our church, like many other churches in India, I would say is still somewhat silent on issues on HIV and AIDS, particularly issues around sexuality. It still is considered a sacred cow in our part of the world, in India in particular. So it's very difficult to start a conversation directly on the issue of HIV and AIDS, or even sexuality for that matter. I used to work for the National Council of Churches in India. When I was there, we tried to organize an institute on human sexuality, which kind of triggered some kind of discussion around HIV and AIDS. So NCCA has now a program on HIV and AIDS, but not the Syrian Orthodox Church in particular. I think one of the most difficult issues that we confront is the whole issue of stigmatization. I think the mainline churches and the mainstream societies still continue to stigmatize people who are affected by HIV and AIDS. Within the church, there are the ultra conservatives and the so-called evangelicals who would think that it's a result of their sinful way of lifestyles and all that. So the issue of stigma is a major challenge for the church and society to deal with. The other issue around the whole problem of sexuality and HIV and AIDS and all that is the whole question of justice. I think HIV and AIDS in the third world context, like India, poses issues of justice, social justice, gender justice, even ecological justice to a certain extent, because most of the people who are affected by HIV and AIDS in the third world are the economically backward sections of our society for all kinds of reasons. They are the most vulnerable to this epidemic. When we deal with this issue, we need to have a perspective of justice, particularly of social justice. And for that matter, when we look at the whole scenario of HIV and AIDS in Asia, and particularly in India, gender justice is going to be a very important perspective, because it's women, especially women coming from the subaltern backgrounds, Dalits in particular, are the most vulnerable and affected. So women, particularly Dalit women in India, continue to be the most marginalized when you talk about HIV and AIDS in our part of the world. That is the reason why I said gender perspective, especially coming from a subaltern perspective, is going to be a very important criteria. The Orthodox Church worldwide are not comfortable with the language of human rights. When the issue is projected as a human rights issue, I think the Orthodox world would get immediately kind of upset about that rhetoric, that language of human rights, because human rights as it is understood in the Western context is very much an individualistic project. It's my right to something. I think strategically, as an Orthodox, as I understand my own tradition, and I would go the theological route. If you want to get a discussion started around these issues, I think the strategy that I would adopt within my own tradition is one of theological anthropology. So you talk about what it means to be a human being in the first place. What does it mean to say that everybody is created in the image of God? All these issues. And through that route, you can come to talk about human rights, justice, and all that. But then, the moment you talk about human rights in the Western sense of the term, the Orthodox world will not be interested in that kind of dialogue. My own sense is that we have a long way to go. Like I said, we have a beautiful theology of equality, because if Trinity is the center point of our whole theology, and Trinity is all about equality, including gender justice. But then in practice, unfortunately, we are not translating all that theology into praxis. That is where I think the Orthodox world has to be challenged even further. When we write theology, when we articulate theology, it's one of the most radical theologies one can ever think of. But then the actual practice, there is this mismatch between what we say in terms of theological articulation and what we practice in the real life of the church.